Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
Salve, meu povo! Aqui é o Igão. Ó, ouvindo um podcast no caminho do trabalho ou enquanto prepara a comida? Acertei? Mas uma coisa que eu sei é que cê tá aí no corre. Hoje em dia, todo mundo é correria. Parece até que o dia tem mais de 24 horas. É por isso que Rexona te dá muito mais proteção para você encarar a sua rotina. Rexona, proteção superior a 72 horas por dia. Rexona não te abandona.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today's topic was actually, I want to shout out, this was suggested by Christy, who is a member of the Patreon community, and it was her suggestion to talk about the person who is known as Pocahontas. She's also aka Matoaka, so we're going to kind of use mostly Matoaka, but both names, and we're going to explain in the episode how and why she has both of these names. And it was a topic that has interested me for a long time, just like as a person who, during my main babysitting era as a teenager, I was babysitting a girl who loved this movie, and I watched it probably every week for a year. So I'm very familiar, or I felt like I was very familiar with the Disney film, but I also haven't watched it in, 20, 30 years. And so anyway, I just know that Pocahontas, the myth, the legend, is so well known, and there's so many things about it that people think that are incorrect. And then I remember that there's this project from a few years ago, the Missing Matoaka project, which is, we're going to talk about it as well, because my guest, Lauren DeLeary, was the screenwriter for Missing Matoaka. And so what it is an audio track that tells the real story that you can sync up to play while you're watching the Disney's Pocahontas movie. Anyway, so I was looking up the project. I contacted Lauren. I was so excited that she agreed to come and be on the podcast because the story is so important to her. And so we're going to listen to Lauren helping us understand the story of the real Matoaka. But first, I wanted to situate this whole story in the history we've already talked about on the podcast and the history you may or may not know about the colonization of America. Because, all of us, we live in a specific era. The way that the world is affects their lives in certain ways, but the way that Matoaka's life, like the way it went, was entirely because of what happened. So on this podcast, we've talked before about when Spain went to colonize Mexico. We did that episode about Melancine, aka La Malinche. So that was all happening around 1512. The English had not really come over to North America yet. But what had happened is that Spain went to around the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico region, and they found oh, hey, guess what is here? Gold, a thing we value a lot. The English were okay, we want to do this too, but we don't want to go to war with Spain. So let's find a place where Spain hasn't gone. So they just kind of went up the coast more and more north, hoping that they would find gold also. They didn't. What they found, though, was tobacco. And so the English colonization of America, they had already successfully colonized Ireland. And so many of the early colonists of North America had their start in colonizing Ireland. And they were let's do the same thing, but in kind of North America region. And where they went, where this story takes place, is around what is modern day Virginia. Virginia named after Elizabeth I, who was the queen when they started doing all this kind of stuff. So the first expedition of English people went to Roanoke Island in 1584, but they were poorly prepared to live there. And by 6 years later, they had all disappeared. And there's numerous podcasts about what happened to those people. But so that colony did not work for the English. 1606, so this is about 20 years after Roanoke. By this time, the king in England is a person that many listeners will be familiar with from my Mary Queen of Scots series. James I, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, he's the king. he granted charters to the London Company for the purpose of establishing a permanent settlement in North America. And so they headed over and they established a permanent colony that they called Jamestown, named after him, on the Chesapeake Bay in what is now Virginia. So at this time, I think they had a couple hundred people were on the ship. And when they arrived, there was about 30,000 Indigenous people living in that region at that time. One of them was a 10-year-old girl named Matoaka. And yeah, so I'll just go right from here into my discussion with Lauren DeLeary, talking about the story of Matoaka and what happened to her, what she did, what her story is. So I'm joined today by Lauren DeLeary. And first of all, can we talk about the name of the person we're talking about today? Because we're not calling her Pocahontas.
Right. So, I mean, I will probably interchangeably call her Pocahontas and Matoaka, which that's her born given name was Matoaka. And yeah, so everybody knows about Pocahontas, but that was her. She chose that name later on. She was about 14 when she chose it, but also as a kid, her father called her Pocahontas endearingly because that was her mother's name. And yeah, so either way, Matoaka or Pocahontas, like I said, I'll probably use it interchangeably.
Let's talk about the Missing Matoaka project.
Yeah. So the Missing Matoaka project, it's an audio track that goes alongside Disney's Pocahontas. So it's an alternative audio track you can play. There's a countdown. So you pull up Disney's Pocahontas on, one tab or like on your, Disney Plus, whatever, wherever you're watching. And then you also go to missingmatoaka.ca and you press play, while you also press play on Pocahontas, on mute. So it'll like coincide with what you're seeing visually. We lined everything up, every single like moment, every second, every millisecond. I wrote the script to line up to what you're seeing on the screen, but telling her story accurately, which was quite a feat because Disney's Pocahontas was not accurate very much at all. So
yeah, when I was watching it, I found it was so perfectly lined up. I was just like, this is wow. The dialogue that other people are saying, or when there's like a silly thing happens with like the hummingbird or the raccoon, like the sound effect is there and everything. But
yes.
As the movie went on and the story got more and more preposterous, I'm just like, how are they going to do this? Because there's these like montages of Pocahontas and John Smith like frolicking in the fields. And I'm just like, how? But I love the way you wrote it. I love that the dialogue. She often is just like, are you going to leave now? Like, can you please leave? As on the screen, they're like lying in a meadow together looking dreamy. And he's like, no, I have to stay here until I've completed the genocide. Like,
right. It's like a bit ironic. You have to write it a little ironic because even still, it's not like Pocahontas, it's not like Matoaka and John Smith had these sort of conversations at all. So like, but we're kind of pretending as if they did. And if they did, she would say something along the lines of like, I'm 10 years old, you're a creep, like, whatever. Yeah. So even though it was like her correct story, it was still a version of it because, the visuals are just so inaccurate.
Yeah, it just got, at first I'm like, okay, you're explaining the story. And then I'm just like, wow, this must have been so challenging as the story gets more and more wild. But also, can we talk for a minute about John Smith? Because from what I've been reading about him, like the reason why the myth of Pocahontas is what it is based because he's the one who told the story initially.
Yeah. So, John Smith, he ended up writing like a memoir, like of his adventures. When it was published and when he wrote it and published it, like people who could have, counteracted or like told the truth of what actually happened were like long gone or not in contact or had no idea it had come out or anything like that. So he just got to tell his version of the story, which is, we've seen many times in history that history can be quite colonized and whitewashed. So this is no different. So John Smith himself, though, he was a crook. He was known to be just a terrible person. People did not like him. He was not the charming blonde, stud that Disney portrayed him to be at all. He was about 27 years old when he arrived. And when he did arrive, though, he was like very sickly. Like he was actually because he was imprisoned on the boats because he was a crook. Like he was known for being a terrible, horrible person. So he was not well, not the stud we have been taught to believe. Within that, he ended up being captured, and he ended up being a werewolf. The Powhatan made him one because he actually ended up liking him. So I'm definitely feeling John Smith was definitely a narcissist. And I know that's like something we kind of throw around now, but I feel like it's pretty easy to see that he was a terrible person, but then he gained favor with the Powhatan. And so he was made werewolf, which basically makes him a leader of the colonists in a way and helps them like kind of have this basically an inside with the villages, and gave him rights that he actually really took advantage of, and just continued to be a terrible, terrible person. So John Smith was not a good guy.
Yeah, and I was looking at stuff about his other writings because before he came to America, he was being sort of a dirtbag adventurer around other like Eastern Europe and different places. And it's an interesting coincidence. Everywhere he went, like the beautiful daughter of a king would throw herself at him to save his life. It's interesting how that kept happening to him.
That's funny. I actually didn't know that about John Smith, like about his other writings and other places he went. That's interesting because obviously my focus was on Matoaka and like her life story.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating. Wow. Yeah, I would definitely see that's just another thing. John Smith was a narcissist.
Or he just, I don't know, he wrote that story once and it went over well. He's like, oh, I'll just say that kept happening to me. When I read
Delusional.
No, I was just like, God, yeah, I know. That's the thing. Okay, so he's out of the way. Let's talk about Matoaka and who she really was and what her story was. And to sort of set the scene, like this is like the first successful English colony in the New World. So when they encounter John Smith and everybody, this is like the first time this has really happened, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, first of all, if people don't know, like her story she was probably born around the late 1500s, so early 1600s. So it was about 400 years ago, over 400 years ago. And yeah, she was touted around as like a successful colonization. It was used for trade, used as like this proof of, oh, we're like, we're friendly. She was kidnapped, which is how she was used, by the way. Like she was taken away and then she was forced to marry. She was raped and forced to marry. So anyway, and they converted her to Christianity and they touted her around as that like successful token of like, oh, look at all the good things that we're doing over in that land. We're saving them. We're making them quote unquote civilized. So yeah, but when the European invaders made their way over, she was probably about 10 years old. And like I mentioned, she was the Powhatan's daughter, so the chief's daughter. And so she had a lot of people in the tribe like taking care of her, looking after her. She was not like this little sex cat in the woods, unlike the false narrative. She did not abandon her people at all. And like I said, European invaders kidnapped her and held her hostage. And so her father felt threatened that if he came to rescue her, that she would be harmed. And so he kind of kept his distance with her, but that's later on. So from 10 years old to, 14, the idea that like she had any sort of like conversation or any type of relationship with John Smith is just absolutely crazy because she would have been so like watched after and like cared for by so many of the people in the tribe. She also had, lots of siblings, probably as a Powhatan. He likely had multiple wives too. So there was a lot of people looking after her. And the only time that she would ever be going into like Jamestown, which wasn't just like down the street. It was like kind of a travel day away. She would have gone with her people, and she was taken one time with her people as kind of this reflection, this token as like innocence, because she was a kid, and they're like, hey, by the way, we're showing up, but we come in peace because look, like we're bringing our most prized possession, like our child, like our Powhatan's daughter, his favorite one at that. And so that would be the only time that she would be in Jamestown. So she didn't escape. She wasn't running to John Smith. She was with her family and with those who were like looking after her. And a fun part of her story a bit is that she was her dad's favorite. Her mother died, and so after her death, obviously her father was like devastated, and because she looks like her, I think he really loved her and like favored her. And that's why he like would give her the name Pocahontas, because that was her mom's name. And so it's like a loving, endearing thing. And they chose to call her Pocahontas around the European invaders, to kind of keep her identity sacred, keep that protected, which is why you see that her name as Pocahontas is the most known. However, when she was 14, she was in a ceremony where she got to choose her name, and she did choose Pocahontas. So anyway, Matoaka is very much her name, and so is Pocahontas. And later in life, she actually had a third name, Rebecca. So it was a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot for a very short life. So if we're just going to do some myth busting, so there's the John Smith told and like commonly retold story, including in the Disney film, that Pocahontas's father was going to kill John Smith, and then she came and like threw herself over him to be like, no, don't kill him. What's interesting is just from what I was reading too, is that when that allegedly happened, which it didn't, John Smith didn't write about it. It's only later on he's like, oh yeah, like 20 years later, he's like, yeah, this thing happened to me and he was going to kill me. So it's like, maybe there was some ceremony. Maybe it's like when he was named a werewolf, and he's just kind of like embellishing.
Oh yeah. So, well, the thing is, when there is a ceremony when someone is made a werewolf, and children would not have been allowed. So she wouldn't have even been there. She wouldn't have been in that sort of ceremony. Also, this ceremony is an honor. It was not any sort of like the Pohan did not have any intentions of killing John Smith. He was honoring him. So he definitely very much got that twisted. And yeah, so there's no way that Matoaka Pocahontas would have been there at all. And his life was not in danger either.
John Smith, this guy. So what I found really interesting too, when I was watching your audio track of the film, and just remembering when I first watched it too, I didn't realize that Kocoum was a real person.
Yeah.
Like everybody else in the film, he's like done so dirty.
Yes. So she ended up marrying Kocoum. So I'll kind of go backwards. She married Kocoum at around 14 or 15. So before that, like she was just a kid, and that's why in that ceremony she got to like choose somebody to dance with, and she chose Kocoum. It was likely kind of set up as well, like within the village, like who was who, and they had a kid. She got pregnant like pretty much like right away. And for a long time, the child was just called Little Kocoum because people didn't know like what the name was of the child, or even like if it was like a boy or girl, like they didn't know. But later on, we did find out that she did end up having a girl and was raised by obviously the village. So the story of Kocoum he was not some like angry, like just Disney's portrayal of him. He was also like younger, and he was actually killed when they kidnapped Pocahontas. When they kidnapped her, they didn't want him going after her, like rescuing her, so they actually killed him off, which is just horrible because honestly it was just so much was so unnecessary, obviously. But like even that, I think watching it back, watching the movie as I'm like writing the script, it's just so sad to see how he was portrayed when really it was just all these stories like the native people were a lot of the time so innocent in this, and made out to be, well, savages, as the movie and the song kind of makes people see it.
I appreciated with your audio track. So I was watching it, and then I don't know, just the settings on my TV. Like I had the closed captioning on for the actual script, and then I was listening. So it was interesting at times because I could see what they were saying, and then what your script.
Yeah.
So it was funny because the actual film is saying like, "Oh, Kocoum, he's so serious. I don't like him." And in the audio track, it's being like, "Kocoum is a great warrior, and I appreciate him." I was like, "I love what you've done." Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of the time, because it was like a roadmap, honestly. I was like, okay, what's the opposite of what she's saying? Sometimes it was crazy. But yeah, so that was a really a story that was very much convoluted. All of it was, but that to me, I don't know, it just really stuck out when I was rewriting it, because she also chose him. So I don't know if it was a story of love, but like she did have the autonomy of choosing who she ended up marrying, and then having a child, and then she never got to see that child again either. It's sad. And she ended up having another child, but that was out of wedlock and due to rape. So that was a completely different situation later on.
And just to keep up with like how young she is. So like she's around 10 years old when the colonists first arrive. She gets married to Kocoum when she's around 14, has this child. So in the chronology, which is like not weird in their culture. That's just like,
No.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's 14 or 15. Like that would be very appropriate age at that point. I mean, if you look at even today, like she would have had hit puberty already, and everything would have been like just totally appropriate. Again, Powhatan's daughter, like her life was set up. Like she was good. Like she was okay. She was taken care of. And she was favored. So yeah, she was clearly living with Kocoum at the time when she was kidnapped. And that was like when the Anglo-Powhatan War began, and that's why she was captured by Samuel Argall, because he wanted to keep them from attacking, keep the natives from attacking them. Like, well, if we have one of yours, then you won't hurt us. And so that was sort of the attempt.
Right. And so it's sort of the flip side of what you just said. Like she was the daughter of Powhatan, like of the chief. She was so important. She was so valued. And that's the danger of that, is they knew that if we're going to kidnap somebody, her, like she's the one who's the most valued. She's the one, his favorite daughter. Like she's the most precious person. So that's why she was chosen.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's like, again, what I was really passionate about with this retelling was that she never abandoned her people. I mean, you can see it in now corrected history that she didn't. She just kind of like went. She survived it, and didn't want her people, like, any harm coming to her people. So she just went along. But when she was captured, though, she was raped, and probably raped by like multiple people, and had gotten very anxious and depressed for very obvious reasons. And so they actually had her oldest sister come alongside and like go with her to kind of help her with that depression and fear. So she, like I said, she did end up getting pregnant, and then was forced to marry John Rolfe, who, yeah, so she had a son, and she raised him for a couple years before her death.
So John Rolfe, I haven't watched Pocahontas 2. After I finished watching the first one with the audio track, I was like, oh, I want to watch the second one. I'm like, no, I don't actually want to watch the second one. I would want to watch the second one if you had done an audio track for it.
Yeah.
But as I understand it, in the second one, that's like she meets and falls in love with John Rolfe, which is like not true. There's also the, I haven't watched this. There's the movie The New World, the Terrence Malick one. And I guess in that one, they show her and John Smith having a romantic relationship, and then her and John Rolfe having a romantic relationship. It's like people just can't stay away from this narrative of like, these were love stories. Because if you look at what the actual story is, it's like, oh, this is horrific. Let's not make a movie. This is not. entertaining. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, it's a horror story. Like it's not love. Like it's a horror story, truly. So that doesn't exactly sell to kids
No.
and their families.
So John Rolfe, so she's there, like she's kidnapped. Actually, can we just talk for a minute about the way that the Missing Matoaka Project, and I've seen in other interviews you speak about um, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and that
Hmm.
aspect of her story. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So this obviously her story, yes, it was over 400 years ago, but this is still very much a problem today with missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So with this project, we're just like, we're so passionate about helping support accurate Indigenous representation in the media and, by telling the truth, hopefully showing the harmful effects of stereotypes. Um, and obviously, like in the film, she is seen as this like available sex cat woman, like who wants to betray her people and go be with the white guy and like, whatever. So that depiction continues to shape like this false narrative about Indigenous women being more sexually available and less worthy than non-Indigenous women. And that has truly manifested into something like the real world statistics of Indigenous women are that they are 12 times more likely to be murdered or go missing than any other demographic group. And 4 out of 5 Indigenous women experience violence in their lifetime. So that's real world statistics happening today. Which is why this is such a big deal, and why we need to change the narrative, why we need to course correct. We need to tell the story correctly because it does make an impact today. And so the project, I hope is inspiring to other Indigenous people that like we need to tell our stories and we need to, feel like we are able to take up the space to let our voices be heard and let our stories be heard, but also to not ignore the history. So hopefully, like there's like proactive steps that help break down stereotypes that hypersexualize and demean Indigenous women and girls, and to essentially end the practices that perpetuate the myth that Indigenous women are more sexually available and less worthy just because of their background or their race.
Well, and I think connected to that is just like watching this movie again, which I haven't seen since I was like 12 years old. But watching it now, it's just like, oh my God, like there's no other Disney princess who has this sexual of a story. Like her body is extremely curvaceous in a way that like you're not seeing in Frozen or Cinderella. Like she's drawn as such a sexual object. The way she moves, like you call this out in your audio track, where she's like prowling through the woods, like this sex cat.
Yeah.
And then also her and John Smith, like they kiss several times. And I'm like pretty sure.
It's disturbing.
Yeah. There's not just the fact that like she's 10 and he's 27, but like I don't recall any other Disney animated movie where the main character is this sexual. Like, and the fact that it's their only Indigenous character. And then it leads to stuff like Halloween costumes, like,
yeah.
Because her outfit is very sexy in this movie.
Right. So like who doesn't want to be like that, especially on Halloween, but kids. Yeah. So my passion for correcting her story began very young for me. If I haven't mentioned it yet, I am Indigenous. I'm Ojibwe. I was raised knowing semi the truth of Pocahontas, right? I mean, you don't exactly tell like a 6-year-old her whole story, but I knew there was inaccuracy. And I also knew that, and I was taught by my family that dressing up as Pocahontas was, or like as a Native American, just like dressing up as a Native, is disturbing. We're not a costume. We're not like something to just like poke fun of, especially because as a kid, like where I grew up, nobody knew that natives were like, that they still existed. It almost like quote unquote Indians, right? Were like from Peter Pan, they were like similar to a mythical creature as like a mermaid. And so I remember as a kid being proud of being Indigenous and telling people I was and telling kids and whatever. And they would either tell me I'm lying because they thought, again, that I was saying I was a mermaid. You know, they're like, no, you're not. Or they would be like, well, where's your teepee? Or like, where's your costume? Or, you know, whatever. And there's no acknowledgement. There's no education on one, the right history of natives, but now we're fixing that. But also as a kid, especially again, where I grew up, like that we live today, like there's modern Indigenous people, like we are here today, which kind of just blows my mind. And depending on where you are in America, some people know more than others, but where I grew up, no, they knew nothing. I was the only Indigenous person for miles, and well, besides my siblings, of course. So there's a lot of just like education that I just came out swinging as a little kid, being like, well, you need to know that her name was called, and like Matoaka, and you know. So when this project came across, like, you know, when it showed up, when they asked me to be a part of it, I was like, yeah, this is my passion. Like, let's go. Let's tell her story right.
I feel like what you just said, like the concept, it's like being a mermaid. Like it's not people not realizing that like there are still Indigenous people today. So if your first exposure to the entire concept of this is watching this film, and there's stuff like, and you talk about this in the audio track, like the song Savages is just like, oh God, like.
Yeah. I remember the first time, so I had this little friend. I was young. I probably was like somewhere between 4 and 7. And I remember we were close, but he loved Native stuff. He was like, I think he watched Pocahontas and, you know, really loved that I was Native. And it was just like this little cute little friendship, crush, whatever. And then I remember going to have a play date with him. And for some reason, he decided to like change his tune. And he was like, he must have seen something with a cowboy or something. Cause like, I remember he got like stirrups and like got all cowboy, got a cowboy hat, whatever. And I remember him like pulling out his like little fake gun from his like whatever. And he was like, you're a dirty savage, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, we were friends and now we're not. And that was like the first time I had like experienced somebody calling me a savage and pulling out a gun, pretending to kill me because I'm this dirty savage Native. And I knew what he was referencing because I had seen Pocahontas clearly. But I didn't fully understand until that point that this is bad. This is bad for us. This is bad for Natives. And like I said, I was like between 4 and 7. So like how I processed it was different, but I just knew from that moment on, we were not friends anymore.
Well, and it really speaks to the importance of, if someone's not living in a place where there are Indigenous people around, then everything you learn is from pop culture. And it's like old pop culture. It's like cowboy movies or this Disney film. And so anyway, that's terrible.
Yeah, I think the 2 main films was Pocahontas and Peter Pan that people knew about, like just knew about Natives. That was it, like as kids, especially, like that's all they knew. So that's what they referenced.
Ugh. And that's, anyway, the 2 extremely awful examples. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
Desde 2019, a Toyota vem acelerando o futuro, produzindo no Brasil o primeiro híbrido flex do mundo. De lá pra cá, as coisas mudaram. Muitos entraram na tendência que a gente criou. Mas sabe o que não mudou? A confiança do brasileiro na Toyota, que não veio da noite pro dia. Toyota, no futuro há muito tempo. Paz no trânsito começa por você.
Desfrute do novo Icon of the Seas da Royal Caribbean, agora partindo de Miami. É o ícone das férias repleto de atrações, com o maior parque aquático no mar e espetáculos sensacionais da Broadway. Com destinos incríveis no Caribe, incluindo a premiada ilha particular Perfect Day at Coco Cay, a aventura nunca acaba. Icon of the Seas, as melhores férias em família do mundo. Acesse royalcaribbean.com/BRA. Aplicam-se termos e condições.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. And then the extremely awful actual story. So she became pregnant through sexual assault, and then she was married to this guy, Thomas Rolfe. And his whole deal, what I gleaned is the whole reason why the colonists were there was really to try and find a crop that they could sell to make money. And they were like, tobacco,
Yes.
That's it, let's do it. And so there were some sort of like techniques for curing tobacco that the Powhatan knew. And he was like, well, if I marry her, then they'll teach me these techniques, and then my tobacco will be the best tobacco, basically.
Yeah. I mean, you got it. I mean, that's pretty much right. Yeah. So she had her son, Thomas, and then married John Rolfe. But yeah, he married her to like gain favor, actually with both sides, like, showing that there was progress happening and that there were natives who liked them and, were helping them and whatever. So yeah, it became very successful because they cultivated a new strain of tobacco that way and like pillaged the lands, which was gut-wrenching for the native people who like our whole sentiment, our whole like life's breath is like to live in harmony with earth and with nature. So it was just as horrific to see the earth essentially be brutalized as it was the people, because it was like one and the same. So yeah, it was the way that the curing tobacco, the way that, like, that was part of ceremony and is part of ceremony. It was sacred. And so he had to marry her in order to like gain the permission to know and to learn just the way that they cured tobacco, because they were not doing it well by themselves. So they needed help. And so, yeah, that's why she was forced to marry him.
And this is around the same time she like converted to Christianity and was given the name Rebecca. Yes.
So, after they were married, they forced her to Christianity. And again, it was another level of like, look, we're saving them. We're making them civilized. Look at this one. Like, she has a white name now. And she's like, married to a white man and whatever. So it was just like further proof, quote unquote, of the success that they were having. But it also, like I said, it worked in their favor on the side of like, well, then the native people like didn't want to harm, and like her father didn't come to rescue her because he was scared that she was going to be hurt if he did. So he stayed away, which is just, it's just so sad, like, to think about, like, yeah. And, fast forward she did end up being poisoned. So
he was right to be concerned, obviously. But I think also the fact that he didn't come after her, I've seen that has been reframed by some retellings as saying that he didn't care. And that's why he didn't come after her.
yeah, right. That's what they told her, which, I mean, you can know all the truth in your heart, but like if you're 17 years old and like you've been in captivity and being touted around, like you're going to believe it. And like, I hope it's like, you kind of hope that she like didn't, but I mean, you're still a child and like aren't being rescued. Like, what else do you think? So that to me is just like sad. Like what her last few years were like, just with the mental torture, not just like physical, but the mental torture. Like I truly can't even imagine.
Yeah. When I'm on this podcast, like when I'm looking at stories, I really try to be like, here's what the woman was doing and here's what she was thinking and but Matoaka is really just like, she wasn't in a space to be able to do anything. It's just stuff was just happening to her. And like every day, all she could do is just survive, really.
Yes, exactly. And I think because like, again, she didn't want to cause harm to her people. The total opposite of how she was portrayed. Like she was portrayed as if she wanted to like betray her people. It was completely the opposite. She went along with what she needed to do to for herself to survive and also like to not cause harm to her people.
And also, there's not a roadmap for what was going on with her and with them. Like they didn't know the end result of colonization, but also this is the first time there had been this extended amount of time with colonists in America, with Indigenous people. Like they didn't know where this was all headed. Nobody knew what was going on, really.
Right.
So how can they make decisions of what to do next when no one really knows what is happening?
Of course, which, you know, after she had been in England for a while, they told her that she was going to be going back to Virginia, quote unquote. I say that because like that's not what it was called to her, but yeah. And what the history tells us, and what like her sister had noted, that she was in really great health before she got on board to go home, and she had hardly got they hardly even got going, and she got very sick all of a sudden, and they took her off the boat, and she died shortly after, which it points to a poisoning. I mean, so yeah, it's just horrible how her life ended, and like who knows like why that was like needed, if they were like nervous that they were nervous that they were going to be harmed when they brought her back, because they had essentially kidnapped her for way longer than they had agreed to, because it was at first an agreement of like, we'll take her for a while and she'll come back. So they probably were scared of retaliation of Native people, which it would have been warranted. And so by her just dying, it kind of like was like, in a way, solved their problem and probably kept them from feeling fear that they were going to be threatened by the Native people.
Her time in England was basically she and John Rolfe and Thomas and other people, like she had her sister, I think, was with her, and her sister's husband. And what they did in England was basically they just kind of like dressed her up in like European style clothes. And they're like, look, it's Rebecca. Like, look how she's like civilized. And the intent of that was to be like, so if you could fund our further missions, that would be great.
Yeah.
Like she was just kind of there to advertise their success so they could get more investors. And once that was done, I guess they're like, okay, we don't need her anymore.
Yep. Probably. They're like, thanks for that. Goodbye. Like, we literally don't need you anymore. Which, who knows what her like relationship and marriage was like to Rolfe in that meantime. Now there is record that she did see John Smith during some point when she was in England, and she did express to him like how angry she was about the mistreatment, and especially because he was a werewolf and made a werewolf, like she let him have it. But yeah, it's just little Coquam obviously was like raised without her, and then her son Thomas actually ended up I'm pretty sure returned to Virginia as well at some point.
Yeah, I've got this later on in my notes about her son, but that just reminded me about John Smith because I think this is important for people to know, just in the continuing narrative of He Sucks, is that
Yeah.
in the original story, like not the original story, he was over in like the Virginia quote unquote area. And then he went back early because of a gunpowder accident, like whatever that means. So in the movie, it's like he was heroically shot and he was sent back, where it's like, no, he was just a dumbass. And then
Yeah. Yeah, he like literally was stupid and then had an injury and had to go back. Yeah.
yeah. And so I think, oh, now I'm confusing what I read with like what this saga is. But I think Pocahontas was told he was dead. And then she went back to England and it's like, surprise, he's not dead. And I think she was mad partially about being misled about that too.
I mean, yeah, she had a lot to be mad about.
Yes. And I do and it was he recorded like what their interaction was like. And he was saying that she was so upset about things. But also I think probably the fact that she went to England and she was kind of a celebrity when she was there. That's part of where he was like, oh, if I write a book about how I met her, then that's going to bring me money. Like, so that's part of where she became well known, which is why he kind of pounced on that to like make his own living as a memoir writer. But he sucks. So just so everybody knows.
Yeah, he's awful. He's the worst.
Nothing he did was ever not awful.
Yeah, and it just, I think that watching the movie and like knowing that about him, I'm like, how could you even do that? Like, how did Disney think that like writing this story about this crook, this horrible crook that like was known to be a crook, like that wasn't something that wasn't even hidden in history, like that was out there, and this creating like this love story between this crook and a 10-year-old, like that's so messed up. I don't know how they even like how that got approved.
Everything about it, just watching it now, like as an adult, I was just like, my eyes were just like so wide. I'm just like, what is happening? How does this exist? Like everything about it is just like, oh God, like this is like, not to mention the fact that she goes to talk to like a talking tree.
Yeah, that further points to the mythical creature, magical power story about Native Americans. Again, it's like, oh, they're like mermaids. They can do this. They're like fairies. They can, all these little magical powers that furders that stereotype.
Yeah, of just being not like, yeah, this mythical,
not human, savage, like just different, like other. They're not human.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything about that movie is, oh my gosh, I don't.
Well, the thing is too, I think about, I'm like, they could have written a story about Pocahontas as a child, like before even like the European invaders like came, like could have been like, oh, like this young girl was born in this tribe and she was her father's favorite. She had lots of siblings and like, you know, they could have even done up to like Cocoa Woman having a baby, like, and then, I mean, again, it's like, then that's not the full truth, but at least it would have been the truth. Like you could have done the truth up to a certain point, you know. They decided to just, nope, we're gonna make it all up.
It's bizarre. And it's I'm pretty sure, the only Disney princess movie where it's based on a real person also.
Right. Yes, exactly. I'm like, you could have chosen so many things. Like, why that?
And the fact that the fact that the other movies, like in the princess series, are about fairy tale magical places, I can understand why a child would understand this is also about a fairy tale made up thing.
Yes.
Like, why would you think this one actually
is
based on facts?
It's in fairy tale books.
Is it?
Yeah. Well, like it's in fairy tale books. It's in princesses books. Like it's open up. I mean, I had like this big fairy tale book where it had like all the different stories. Yeah, it was in there. It was fairy tale.
So it makes sense that people would understand it as a fairy tale, as not a thing that happened.
Of course.
Yeah.
Which is why we're telling the truth of it.
Yes, I'm just myth busting here. Just people need to know.
Exactly.
So she died in England, and I found this really everything about her life from the time the colonists came, or I guess from her kidnapping on, is just awful. But I found it awful that she was buried in England. that her remains were never returned.
Yeah. And then they say that like we don't know where her remains are because some church was destroyed in a fire. But I mean, some of that could be true, but you know, up to this point, can we believe anything that's like being said about her? And like, or do they know and don't like want to get, like, there's just so many things. I mean, at this point, I don't even know what her remains would be, but I'm sure at one point it was like, hey, we don't want anybody looking into this because they might find out she was poisoned.
Yeah.
So, which is horrific because in Native cultures, like you need to be with and buried with your family, and like it's literally like beyond the grave, beyond life. It's still like an ongoing tragedy because her body was never returned to her people.
Yeah, I find it kind of odd that there's like, in the absence of knowing where her remains are, but there's like a statue there, like in England.
Yeah, well, she was made a celebrity, like you said.
Yeah, it's just an odd thing. And then her father was so upset that he died shortly after. Yeah, like of grief, basically, because
horrible.
Everything they went through.
It's just horrible. Yeah.
So her legacy, I think, so her son, I'm just looking at what I have here. So her son stayed in England for a while, like was raised by like the Rolfe family, but then he later returned to Virginia as an adult. And he had many descendants, like, so her lineage lived on through him, including the actor Edward Norton.
Yeah. That, and like her daughter, who she had with Coquam, she also had children as well. So yeah, her lineage did carry on, and it's cool to see that like she had people to kind of pass on her life. But yeah, I mean, every bit of when we tell her story, I feel like we're able to give her that the rest in power, you know, rest in peace, rest in power that she really truly deserved.
Yeah, when we tell her real story, because the made up story continues to be still so widely understood and widely disseminated. And I think what your project, just on the website, it mentions one of the books that you looked at was that one, The True Story of Pocahontas, and that draws from the oral storytelling. So a lot of what we know about what really happened is through, because there are people with her, like her sister was with her when she was in England, like, and went to stay with her when she was kidnapped. So like they passed on, like, here's what she was going through, here's the depression she had, like, here's what the story is. So I appreciate that we know her story through her people in that way.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of Native history is passed down orally. That's a kind of tradition. And yeah, I'm glad somebody wrote it down, you know. I mean, we have to, because of like the genocide and like the separation of families, like eventually oral history can't exactly keep up, but I'm glad we have the bit that we do about her, and grateful that her sister was with her in order to like know what was going on and be able to kind of, or else we wouldn't have known anything, like known the truth of any of this. So yeah, I'm grateful that things were passed on.
To, especially if all we had to rely on, and what a lot of people had to rely on for a long time, was just the John Smith books.
Yeah, which is, we all know now, it's so messed up and not even kind of close to the truth.
So at the end of all my episodes, I think I sent you this, but just as a reminder, I score everybody I talk about on the show in 4 different categories.
Oh, okay.
And it's just sort of like, I don't know, because I have the 4 categories to sort of be like, because different people have different strengths, and I want everybody to be able to get some points in one category. So it's on a scale of 0 to 10. And so the first category is scandal. How scandalous do you think she was?
She was?
Yeah. I don't think she was scandalous at all, frankly. I think she was always...
Oh, no, I don't think she's scandalous. There's no record of her being scandalous at all. I mean, I think she was only with Coquam by choice ever. So I'd say like 0 or a 1. You know, I don't know if it begins at 0 or 1.
I'd say 0. Like, I think nothing she ever did was in any way out of line with what was expected of her.
Yeah, no, exactly. So 0.
The next category is scheminess, which I contextualize as not just like a person coming up with like a scheme, but also just somebody who is
Right.
resilient. They're put into different situations and they're able to figure out what to do when they're in those
Yeah.
situations and that sort of thing. And I think she did survive.
Yeah, no, she survived until she like literally was blindly poisoned. So like she couldn't have even known. So as far as like scheme, she played the game she had to play. So I'd say she's like 7 or 8.
Yeah, I'll give her an 8 for that. Yeah, like she's in this impossible, horrible situation, and no one had ever been put in that exact situation before, but she kept going.
And she was young.
Oh my gosh, she was so young. When she died, she was like 21 or something.
Yeah, 20 or 21.
Yeah. The next category is significance.
Oh, well, obviously a 10.
I feel like a 10. I feel like a 10. Like, first of all, just like she's, like her name is well known, but also just like the context of her life. Like this was the first real interaction between like Indigenous people of North America with England.
Right. Yeah. And she was the missing and murdered Indigenous woman, first documented rather. So yeah, she's pretty important.
For sure. She's a 10. And then the final category is, I call it the sexism bonus. So it's basically just like how much did sexism get in her way and hold her back?
Oh my God. A 10. Like pretty close.
I think like there's so much.
Maybe a 9, maybe because it's had also, I mean, most of it likely had to do with her race.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd give that like a 9.
Yeah, I think it's like you can't really differentiate the sexism from the just kind of like racism and everything. But the fact that like she was she was raped, like she was taken and used in these ways, like it's very gendered.
Yeah. Yeah.
So her total score is a 27. I maintain a score of just kind of like all the people we talk about and where they all fit together. A 27 is definitely, there's a lot of people at that number, a lot of notable people. She'll fit right in. Can you tell everybody just like to plug yourself and all the things you're doing and what you want people to know about you?
Oh yeah, sure. So first of all, if anyone wants to watch and listen, you can go to missingmatoaka.ca and you press play on the track and play Disney's Pocahontas on mute. And so that way, and you can also just listen if you don't want to like watch. I do recommend watching along with, but essentially you can play it like a podcast if you'd like. It's about 1 hour and 20 minutes, I believe. So yeah, and then as far as myself, so all of my socials and place you can find me is my name, which is Lauren DeLeary. I am active mostly on my Instagram, but also on my TikTok. I have a podcast called Curiosity, and we have weekly episodes there. But yeah, that's it. Basically, you can find me on my socials. I'm always there.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I was so happy that you were able to take the time to do this because I felt like who can I bring on to talk about this story? And I'm like, who knows it better than you at this point?
Oh, well, thank you. I'm no historian, I will say. Like I don't have a doctorate of history. I will say I'm just like, I'm an Indigenous girly who is passionate about this story and course correcting, was honored to be a part of this project and to be able to tell her story, truly her correct story. So I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for having me on.
I love that conversation. I'm so happy that Lauren joined me on the podcast to talk about this because I just feel like she sat with this story for so long. Like I couldn't think of anyone better to invite on to help discuss this story and kind of all the weird myths and things that built up about it. I wanted to let you know a couple details, sort of connections of this story to other episodes we've done. So when Matoaka and John Rolfe went to London for that trip to England to be like, hey, look how successful we are with tobacco, like, please invest in our company. So King James I is still the king, his wife Anne of Denmark. And so they did, in fact, at one point, attend a banquet, dinner, a masque party that was hosted by King James and Queen Anne. So just thinking about all the people we've talked about in that era, like Francis Howard maybe was there. Like this is the intersection, and this is what we're really going to be looking at next season, the upcoming season, season 7, is a lot of these intersections between people from the Western Hemisphere, from like North and South America, with people in Europe, because this is when a lot of this kind of back and forth started happening. Matoaka being one of the first Indigenous people to ever go to England, but just the fact that so many awful things happening to her in her life. And then on top of that, she had to go and attend a dinner party held by James I and Anne of Denmark, like these nightmare people. If you watch Pocahontas 2, the Disney film, which I have not yet watched, but I might, there is a scene where she meets them. So James I and Anne of Denmark are in Pocahontas 2, which is wild to me. Anyway, so what happened to the London Company after all of this? So because of the success with growing tobacco, which John Rolfe, when he learned how to cure the tobacco, his tobacco became really successful. So the population boomed in Virginia, although the London Company itself was bankrupted, in part due to frequent war with nearby Indigenous people, which led King James to take direct control of the colony of Virginia. Because like these guys like John Smith, John Rolfe, like they were just dumbasses. They didn't know what they were doing. Anyway, so following this, just to try to populate this region, the British started shipping over convicts. So we've talked before in the podcast, and you probably have already heard about how Australia, the British colony there, started by shipping convicts there. But before they shipped convicts to Australia, they shipped them to America. So something like up to 120,000 convicts were eventually shipped over to North America before the American Revolution, and then Britain wasn't able to do that anymore. Meanwhile, so in this Virginia area, like the London Company, like the purpose of this colony was to be merchants, like to grow crops and to make money. So it's very much about making money. And this is what develops into sort of the plantation type economy, driven by chattel slavery in the American South. Meanwhile, a bit further north in New England, the Plymouth Council for New England sponsored several colonization projects, including a colony established by a group of English Puritans, aka the Pilgrims. So the Puritans, and this is all the same, like building out of the stuff we've talked about before, especially in the Mary Queen of Scots season with like John Knox and like Calvinism. So the Puritans were really into this intensely emotional form of Calvinist Protestantism. They wanted independence from the Church of England, and that's why they went over. So this is like the Mayflower is a famous ship name, transported them over to like the New England area. And this is where they established the Plymouth colony on Cape Cod. And actually, these colonists, in 1621, the Plymouth colony was able to establish an alliance with the nearby Wampanoag tribe. I think that might be the story of, quote unquote, the first Thanksgiving. And this helped them. So where Jamestown was constantly at war, having trouble, the Puritans, because of this alliance, they were able to learn effective agricultural practices, and they're able to start doing like fur trade and things. And so I just wanted, this is like really laying some track for some other episodes we have coming up in season 7, actually. So just to explain to you how the English came to North America and how kind of America, like the United States of America, kind of started out, which was like these kind of dirtbag, like plantation owner, tobacco farmer type people in the South. And then further north in like New England, it's kind of the Puritans working out there. So it's already kind of like the North versus the South vibe, and it's all kind of different. Anyway, so that's just some. For me, honestly, I'm telling you this because I needed to look this all up for myself to better understand just kind of the history of North America and where does Matoaka fit into all of this, and what like was John Smith with the Puritans. Like when I was learning about all this, I was sort of confused. If you want to hear more about how John Smith sucks, there's an episode of my Patreon podcast, So This Asshole, about John Smith and all of his stories about how he went to all these different places, and the daughters of kings kept being topless and trying to save his life. He had some interactions with the Bathory family of Transylvania. He had an interesting life, let's just say, John Smith. A person, he sucks, and he had an interesting life, but not as interesting as he tried to make it seem like in his books. And remember, his writings were sponsored by Francis Howard, not the main Francis Howard we know about on this podcast, but one of the other people also called Francis Howard. Anyway, all these connections. If this is your first episode of Vulgar History you've ever listened to, just know everything starts interrelating in all these intricate ways in the various episodes. So this is Vulgar History. My name is Ann Foster. And so we scored Pocahontas with a 27 on the Scandalicious scale, the Fredigan Memorial Scandalicious scale. If you want to see who that makes her be in the neighborhood of, the whole scale is up at vulgarhistory.com. You can look at the scale to see where all the people we've talked about in the show, where they all fit, what I find interesting. I was just trying to find people who had a similar scale, and she has a 27, and so does Anne of Denmark, who is the Queen of England when she went over there. And so this podcast, I want to let you know, if you want to see some other stuff that I'm doing, I have a Substack newsletter now, which is where I write about different people than who I talk about on the podcast. It's sort of a way to, it's just the Vulgar History brand is expanding. So if you just go to vulgarhistory.substack.com, you can subscribe there for either free, or if you want, you can get a paid subscription. Currently, I'm in the midst of doing a series called Tudor, I Hardly Knew Her, where I'm talking about the 6 wives of Henry VIII. And then after that, I'm going to talk about some other women from Tudor history who I've never talked about on this podcast before. You can support this podcast on Patreon, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, where for $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all the episodes. For $5 or more a month, you get early ad-free access to all the episodes, as well as bonus episodes, like I said, to the So This Asshole series, if you want to hear about how John Smith sucks. I also did one about other colonizers. I've done Hernan Cortez, Christopher Columbus. Like, colonization is such an insidious, awful, genocidal thing. And the fact that it was led by these just useless dumbasses makes it, I don't know. There's just a lot to yell about, and I do in those episodes. I also have my bonus Patreon series, Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. Most recently, we've talked about Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which you might not think is a costume drama, but it is. And then also The Brotherhood of the Wolf, which in context with the story of Matoaka is interesting because there is a Native American character, not played by a Native American actor in that film. And he is very much presented as a mystical, magical being. So it really ties into that whole sort of stereotype. Anyway, so yeah, if you join the Patreon for $5 or more a month, you get access to those bonus episodes. And there's a big archive of them. So if you just really want to hear me talk, you can. And also for people who join the Patreon at $5 or more a month, there's a chat on Patreon, which is where Christy, shout out to Christy, suggested doing an episode about Pocahontas. And also we have a Discord that you can access and join. And I like to hang out there and talk to people and see what everyone's up to. Anyway, if you want to listen to just specific episodes of the Patreon episodes, like for instance, like the John Smith episode, you can purchase those for just $5 each without having to become a monthly Patreon member. You can just buy an episode if you want to hear that. I also want to mention our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. This is a 100% woman-owned business that creates beautiful jewelry pieces inspired by the difficult women from history and classical mythology. So there are some overlap in the pieces that they make. There's not a Matoaka necklace, although that could be an interesting choice. Tori, if you're listening, consider it. But there are people we've talked about on the podcast, like Cleopatra, Anne Boleyn, Agrippina, Boudica. The jewelry is beautiful, and they also have other accessories you can buy. Like there's some beautiful hair bows, scrunchies, and things. And you can always get 15% off anything from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. It's commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar. If you want to buy Vulgar History merch, it's available at vulgarhistory.com/store. Or if you're outside the US, you can also shop at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you can. There's a form at vulgarhistory.com. You can email me directly, vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I'm also on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod. And my DMs are open there if you want to get in touch with me there as well. Transcripts of recent episodes are available at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Aveline Malik for providing these transcripts. And until next time, I was going to tell you, I've started doing these teasers. Next week, we're going to be talking more about Indigenous people of North America, specifically Canada, specifically near where I live in Saskatchewan. So stay tuned for that next week. And until then, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Shishin Mugaki. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Ah, the web tore. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's that, Ciri? This is how you deal with fear!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket is in trouble, Akasa. Can we turn on the wind show remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.